we were sitting there one night, and he said, I tell you how I do a lot of my own storyboarding. He had a piece of string, and he turned the string, long string, into a park bench, and then he turned it into carriages talking to each other.
Oh, wow.
Josh visualized things, and here's another thing that he told me about Walt. He said, I said, tell me what you learned from Walt over the years. He said he has an unerring instinct about what needs to be in every film. And he said, it's uncanny. Every movie I've ever done with him, he'll sit in there, we'll all get stymied in a certain area, and Walt will spot the weakness and say, you need a touch of comedy here, it's too intense, you need to have a dog come in and do that. He said, all the years I've been with him, he was dead right on, and none of us could ever figure out, how does Walt have this instinct? Well, it goes back to his early childhood,
Hold on.
Yeah, but Walt had an unerring sense of he had a formula. He said making a movie is like making good soup. You have to have good ingredients. And the first ingredient Walt had for all of his movies was it has to be in good taste. You don't see that in a lot of films today. Second, you have to have interesting characters, good story, surprises, good music, a happy ending. I mean, he had this little checklist in his mind. And so when Walt wanted to do Fantasia, he took Josh, who has been art director on Snow White, and said, you got to be the special, because you are the special effects director. So if you see Fantasia, all those special effects and all those scenes, Josh did them on his giant moviola. Anything that has a special effect. Now, you saw Mary Poppins?
Yeah.
Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke?
Yeah.
I was gone from the studio when that was done, but I talked to Josh afterwards, and he told me that they put a blank screen up, what they call a sync screen, and an empty stage with marks, and he was there he had to be there for the shoot. And all of that stuff that they did, especially with the characters, was done on a blank stage. Then Josh took that, and on his moviola, he added all the characters that danced with them, that sang with them.
The penguin dance with
all of that. Josh Meador did all of that special effects on Mary Poppins, which is the whole movie's full of them. And he did the special effects, of course, on Cinderella and Pinocchio. He worked on all those films.
Yeah.
But he also worked on all the television, the television, the Wonderful World. Here's what he told me about the Wonderful World of Color, besides doing the opening. He said Walt was so fussy that he had Disney engineers go to NBC in Burbank and literally put the film on the chain and balance the colors for at least an hour before the show went on the air. In other words, he would not just send the show over. That's how fussy he was. And of course, Wonderful World of Color gave birth to the color television. I mean, people by the millions went out and bought color television sets because of Wonderful World of Color. And as I was telling Dan before we got on the train that when I was with Josh in the 50s through the early 60s, he was really basically part-time because he was up along the coast painting and so forth and so on. And Josh told me that Walt never took him off the payroll. He was a full-time. That's a great testimonial to Josh Meador and to Walt Disney. Josh was very soft-spoken, unpretentious, down-to-earth, and a real Disney spirit. And he loved a palette. He used a palette knife all the time. I used to watch a palette knife all the time.
He's got some early paintings with low numbers on them that we've done with brushes.
I was with him one evening, and he said, I got to do something. So we come over, and he had a bunch of paintings, and he started cutting them up with a knife. And I said, what are you doing? He says, they're not perfect. I said, I would love them. He said, Joe, let me tell you the secret of being a great painter. You got to paint. You got to make a lot of paintings, and then if something's no good, you got to destroy it because you don't want junk out after you're gone. So Josh, over the years I knew him, destroyed quite a few paintings that he did not think. Well, I would have loved to have them. I've got 3. The Christmas card things he sent out. That's what I've got. But that's how fussy he was. Walt created a thing called The Birth of a Waterfall. And he took the song, an inspirational song about water, and he started out with one. I mean, he spent a couple of weeks working on this, especially after hours when involved. And I would sit and watch him edit it. He started with one drop of water coming down to a leaf, and then the drop would go down, a little stream would come down, and another little stream. And he was putting all of this stuff together from all this stuff out of the library. And by the time it was over, you had these rushing waterfalls over the place. He told a great story. But this is the kind of creative spirit. Now, watching him do it, he said, this is how we did Fantasia. So he would listen to the music, and he had a music cue sheet next to him. And the music would start, and he'd hit the clock, and then the minute the music would change, whatever it was, he would click, okay, 10 seconds, and then, so by the time he was done, he had a chart of the music change, of every change, so that when he edited it, he hit those spots.
Yeah.
So you synchronized the change of the mood of the music on the pace of the music, and he would keep it up, high speed, whatever it was. And that was the genius of that he learned when he was working with Fantasia, because no one had ever done this before. What Josh did was, he's the guy that is able to match the tone, the pacing, and the texture of the music with the image. He would pick the right image for it. That was Walt's genius. That was Josh's genius. He was a bright, shining light. But you stop to think of, he told me on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He did the special effects on that with the monster, the undersea monster, and all this special.
Music, didn't they?
He said that when they shot that, that was the most expensive underwater live action movie they'd ever done. Built this big tank over the studio, and Kirk Douglas and I'm going to have this monster in the water. And he said that to shoot that back then cost $250,000, and everybody was there to watch this scene. And it was like no one had ever done this before. And he said the next day in the sweatbox, he said I was sitting next to the director and Walt, and they looked at the scene. And as the scene come up and as it transpired, you could see the electrical wires on the bottom of the tank.
Oh, no.
They didn't cover them up.
No,
Walt had just spent $250,000 to get this thing shot. And Walt said, and Josh said without hesitation, he looked at the director and said, shoot it over. Now today, they could go in digitally and take all of that out.
Yeah.
But back then, they couldn't do it. But that's how much of a perfectionist Walt. One day I went to the studio and I went to Walt, you know, I used to park right next to Walt's car at times. It was hysterical. And I would, he just parked like everybody, you know, unpretentious, regular car, didn't have a limousine or anything. I almost tripped over Abraham Lincoln's head. It was on the floor in Josh's editing bay, and Josh Meador was on the ground floor of audio animatronics and creating Mr. Lincoln.
Wow.
And all of the characters in the Tiki Room. Josh was the guy behind all of those special effects. And here's what he told me about the Tiki Room. And a lot of this, I don't think I put this in the book, did I, on the Tiki Room? But Josh told me this story one day. We were having either at Carmel or someplace. He said, before Disneyland came about, Walt needed money. And a restaurateur friend of his said, I would like to have, could you build me a really special, neat, really neat kind of restaurant with some unique stuff in it? And so Walt created the Tiki Room. The guy gave him a check for $1 million. And in the process of doing this, Disneyland was, you know, Walt did research on Disneyland for many years.
Yeah.
And when we get off on, but Josh told me on the Tiki Room that finally the Disneyland was really coming to pass. He said, I can't tell you how Walt agonized about giving back this guy's $1 million, but he said, I can't let this be out of the park. It's got to be in the park. That's a story I get directly from Josh, and he ought to know because he worked on all the special effects in the Tiki Room and the thunder and the lightning and all this other stuff. But isn't it amazing? Because one of the things Walt always lacked was money. Well, unlike a lot of people, Walt wasn't a money driven. He wanted money to do things, but once he got it, he spent it. He enlarged the studio. We built the animation center. He built Disneyland. But Walt wasn't about making money and being a big shot. It was about now that we got this, what we can do, you know. But Josh's not only contributed to these animated things, but also the special effects in the Haunted Mansion and the special effects in the Pirates of the Caribbean. Walt, this was his special effects director, and so Josh's influence is all over this place. Did I tell you what Ray Bradbury said about Walt?
No.
He wrote this. He was shopping in Saks on Wilshire Boulevard one Christmas holiday, and he ran into Walt Disney. And he saw Walt had a bunch of presents peeking over him, and he said, "Oh my God, it's Walt Disney! I'm Ray Bradbury. Hello." And Walt says, "I know who you are." He says, "Walt, you're my hero." He went on and on and on. He says, "Walt, can we do lunch?" And Walt said, "How about tomorrow?" So Ray writes in this book about Walt that somebody gave me years ago, that the next day he was with Walt having lunch with him, and he said, Walt said before I left, he said, "You've been so good to us, what can I do for you?" He said, "Open up the vaults," because as a kid he'd gotten some cells, so Walt called over. But here's what Ray said about Walt Disney. Politicians pretend optimism. Walt was optimism. This is a direct quote from Ray. Walt Disney has done more good for this world than most all politicians who've ever lived. I mean, in the imagination and in the culture. You want to know something? Ray Bradbury was dead on right.